welcome back to Expert Talks. I'm Agathe Ducart. Today we're joined by Schiber, an Associate Product Director at Enablon, who will share with us his insight into net zero emissions and the new net zero standard from ScienceBased Targets. Kyle, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be back.
Excellent. So let's start from the beginning. Kyle, what does net zero emission mean, and how is it different from other emission reduction objectives?
Yeah, beginning is a great place to start. So net zero emissions simply means that the amount of greenhouse gases that are being released into the atmosphere is the same as the amount of greenhouse gases being removed from the atmosphere. There are other emission reduction targets you might hear, something like committing to reduce emissions by a percentage value against some baseline value, or you might hear 1.5 degrees C thrown around, and that means reducing emissions by a large enough amount to hold global warming to a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. 1.5 C is a number that comes from the IPCC's report on the impacts of climate change. And in short, if we hold global warming to a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, that'll be bad, but not disastrous. Net zero goes further than just reducing emissions. To be net zero emissions, all of the emissions that are produced have to be offset by carbon or other GHGs being removed. So for business, that might mean planting trees or fixing carbon into the ground or purchasing carbon credits from a company that does that carbon removal themselves.
So net zero emission sounds like a good goal to aim for, but that seems difficult to achieve too. What are businesses doing to actually make steps towards net zero?
Yeah, net zero emissions, definitely easier said than done. There are real challenges just to be able to measure or understand what a business's emissions actually are, and let alone knowing what to do to reduce or to offset those emissions. So let's assume, though, that we have a really clear handle on where our emissions are coming from and what the amount of emissions we're emitting are. So the first step is to reduce those emissions. So choosing cleaner energy sources is a logical first step. Moving to more efficient equipment or operations processes are also things that are really easy to identify. But then you start getting into scope 3 GHG emissions and tracking GHG emissions all up and down the value chain of that business. So you'll also start there thinking about having more efficient suppliers of raw materials, or seeing where you can use electric vehicles for fleets and transportation of products, choosing more efficient waste disposal methods, and so on. And then after you've reduced as much as you can reduce, you offset the remaining GHG emissions by putting an equal amount of carbon back into the ground.
So there's a lot that companies can do already to reduce emission and meet net zero targets. Is the challenge for businesses just the complexity of implementing all of those changes?
No, it's actually more of a challenge than that. So even with all of these changes that I've mentioned, it's still probably not enough for a large business to meet a net zero commitment. So even with all those changes implemented, their emissions are still going to be too high, and it's going to be too expensive or infeasible to offset the emissions that remain. So it's also going to take large, long-term changes to businesses. It may take new technologies that haven't even been invented yet, or changing the way the business operates itself. So there may be a range of difficult options available, each with a different chance of success or amount of emissions reduced. And so now you're in this really abstract, strategic realm of thinking. So now you need to measure the risk of all these options that you have in order to measure and identify which options are worth pursuing, and to measure the overall chance of success that you have at actually meeting your net zero target. So you'll need to tie this together with long-term emissions reduction objectives, to the initiatives that are going to help you get you there, to the actual data and KPIs that you're measuring to understand whether you're on track to meet your initiatives. And so you're tying in risk and understanding your overall chance of success and failure. And that's a really big challenge. That's a really big strategic challenge for companies. And so it's not just a matter of tactically working through and implementing the list of actions to reduce emissions.
Yeah, that seems pretty complex indeed. I read recently that the ScienceBased Targets initiative recently released a net zero standard. What does it mean for businesses?
Yeah, science-based targets builds frameworks that help companies make real, achievable, clearly defined commitments. So they've recently released a framework that will help companies define their net zero targets. So that's the beginning of the net zero journey for companies that choose a science-based target. First, they're going to set their target using that framework, and from there they decide how to reduce and how to offset their emissions.
Well, that makes sense. Well, thank you. You mentioned that reaching net zero emission is a journey, and seeing how complex and long term these goals are is surely be true. So, Kyle, thank you so much for your time and insight, and we can't wait to have you back for another expert talk soon.
Glad I could help. Always happy to share my thoughts.
And thank you all for watching Expert Talks. Stay tuned for more on industry topics.